Hello everyone, Professor Zeeb here, and welcome to another audiovisual lecture. This particular time, what I'm going to teach you is something called temperament. Okay, so we're going to look at temperament. You know, an easy way to kind of think about temperament, it's kind of like a personality of a child or how they generally react to things. You could also argue it's kind of like their unique and stable style of behaving. It's another way to kind of think of it. However, we're going to get a lot more specific and look at some research connected to this one. So let's get to our slides here. All right, so we're going to take a look at temperament. You know, the way we sort of technically define temperament, it would be the child's personality, their emotional style, how they react to things, so reactivity, including, you know, for example, if they transition to a new environment or new activity, how smooth does that go? Some children very easily adapt to new situations. Other children, it may take them a few minutes to kind of do that. You know, as we kind of look at this picture here, we have these two twins, and notice that their reaction or their emotional state is very, very different. We may have a very happy-go-lucky child that we kind of see here, where this child may not like being focused on or like attention, and thus it creates a different reactional style or temperamental style, if you will. Okay, so let's take a look at temperament here. We're going to look at where temperament actually comes from. You know, it actually is the classic combination of nature and nurture, the stuff that we talked about in chapter 1. Okay, so you could argue that biology provides the basis for temperament. In fact, the very famous researcher Kagan believed that there's a biological explanation for temperament, that we come pre-wired, or biology gives us this push, if you would, to have a certain temperament style. So certainly we have some evidence that supports that. We know that, number one, temperament is observable in the first few days after birth, which sort of indicate that it's possibly a genetic thing. Also, when we look at twin studies and adopted twin studies, we find that twins often share a temperamental style, especially identical twins, so that once again leads us to believe that there is a genetic component to it. That being said, temperament is also influenced by the child's interactions with their environment. So in other words, we know that environmental features can contribute this and even change certain temperamental styles that were possibly introduced by biology. So things like the social environment of the child, cultural influences, the way the parents react and respond to the child, even with training. We have seen cases where these temperamental styles can change. So certainly they are not set in stone. But once again, we think that both of these areas are probably important. You know, the classic nature nurture with genetics, biology, and then of course the environmental influences. Here's some things to kind of keep in mind as we go through the research and when you consider temperament, especially as a parent. Number one, does the child mesh well with the environment? This is something we call goodness of fit, if that sort of is met, if the parents are sort of responding to the temperamental style of a child and it's fitting closely without tension and problems. So it turns out the social atmosphere can be associated with the child in certain ways. So for example, if I have an introverted child, as a parent, I have to understand that, and I'm going to approach them very differently than, say, a child that's very outgoing or what we call extroverted. So being shy versus outgoing is kind of what I mean by that. Temperament influences how a child selects and responds to their environment. And thus, that affects how people react to the child. So in other words, if a child has a particular temperamental style, the parents may react to that and treat the child accordingly, which causes the child to react to that treatment, if you would. So if you guys remember from earlier chapters, they covered something called reciprocal interactions. And so this is the classic example of that, how my behavior may cause you to change and your behavior as a result of that causes me to change in return. So it's like this flip-flopping of interactions and change that happens, and certainly that's heavily involved with something like temperament. You also have to understand that a child's temperament affects how they perceive and think about the world. So this may actually influence those types of cognitive skills. So for example, if you're a pessimistic person, if you were born with this sort of inclination to be pessimistic, you may view the world as very threatening compared to, say, someone who's sort of happy-go-lucky and trusting and things like that. So certainly it could affect those types of behaviors and those types of experiences. So next, we're going to look at some really classic research here, some landmark study here. And this is the very famous New York longitudinal study conducted way back in 1956. This was a study of 141 children where they analyzed their temperamental style and were able to categorize children in different categories of temperament, if you would. So as we go through this, please think of a child that you know, whether it's your own child or maybe a neighbor, niece or nephew kind of thing, and see where you would sort of place them. Okay, so let's look at what the study found. By the way, this was conducted by Chess and Thomas. They believe that these temperamental differences that they find in children or found in children seem to be moderately stable throughout childhood. Remember, the environment can always change things, but in general, they found some stability. So let's look at our different categories that they came up with. Number one, we have what's called an easy child, so easy children. This is every parent's dream. This is, basically the child you probably want. So as an example, and by the way, this made up 40% of the sample. These children have regular body functions. They have a low to moderate intensity of reaction. In other words, they're pretty easygoing. They also found that these children easily accept new situations. So for example, let's say that they're involved at like a party or something, like a birthday party, and they're transitioning to different activities. This is the child that does that seamlessly. I mean, they're just very smooth and very able to do that and stay happy. It doesn't bother them at all. In fact, they're often described as being very cheerful and that they smile easy. So just kind of happy-go-lucky, easy, easily adaptable, a very positive type attitude, if you would, or temperamental style in this case. The next one, not so much, and that's called the difficult child. And this one is a tough sort of situation for parents. So this made up about 10% of the sample, according to Chess and Thomas. So let's kind of describe what this particular child would be like. So number one, irregular body functions. We said with this first one, it's more regular. This one, irregular. These children react very intensely. In fact, almost in a negative fashion. That's pretty characteristic of the reactional style. They also noted that they're very frustrated. So in other words, let me say that again. They're frustrated easily, so a little bit on edge kind of thing. And they also found that they withdraw from new stimuli. So for example, this is a child when you take him to, say, a birthday party or something, and they do not like it. They do not want to stay. They don't want to transition to the next activity. In other words, it's very difficult. They may cry while doing that. So as you can see why we kind of named them difficult children. It's hard for them to transition, and they react in almost a very negative type style. Our last one, and this reminds me of my own kids, is slow to warm up, probably me personally as well. This made up about 15% of the sample, okay? So with these children, they have a mild to low intensity of reaction, so kind of moderate. They're described as being somewhat cranky, maybe inactive at times, but really to me, what really kind of paints a picture of this one is that they adjust slowly to new experiences. In other words, it may take them a few minutes to kind of warm up to a social situation, as an example. We've been giving the birthday party example throughout the lecture. So let's say you take this child to a birthday party. In the first few minutes, they may sort of cling, or they may not want to stay, or they may have kind of a difficult time. But after a few minutes, they seem to warm up to the situation, and they're completely fine. So you can see why we give them that name, slow to warm up. It just takes them a few minutes to kind of warm up to the situation to be comfortable. So research also found that they gradually develop interest, as the name sort of implies. Now, you may have noticed as we've gone through these that the statistics or the percentages do not add up to 100%. So the remainder of the children in the study, they found maybe a combination of some of these types. In other words, they may be in between a difficult child and a slow to warm up to the point where they could not place them in one category or the other. So sometimes we see like hybrid categories, if you would, or just combinations where they're kind of in the middle of some of those categories, if you would, okay? All right, I wanna make sure that we cover goodness of fit. So this is an important concept related to temperament. Okay, so it's kind of complicated, but this is parents' demands and expectations which are compatible with their child's temperamental style, abilities, and/or characteristics. In other words, what we're saying here is that these parents have this particular child with a certain temperamental style. They have catered the way they interact with that child to fit that temperamental style to avoid tension and problems and meltdowns and things like that. In other words, it's a good fit to that child's environment, to the parents' environment of how they treat them and interact with them. For example, one of my nieces had a temperament that was very sensitive. I remember this particular niece being very cautious and being very sensitive to new situations, different things, just, would cry easily and that kind of thing. So I remember, watching her parents, but also the way I interacted with her is that it was almost like you had to walk on eggshells to be very careful with this child, to not get them upset or to kind of set them off. In other words, I'm going to approach that child very differently than, say, a happy-go-lucky, easy child where they transition very smoothly. So as a parent, you really have to kind of think about how am I going to interact with this child? Because obviously we don't want them to be upset and to create tension. We want it to be a smooth experience and want them to be comfortable. So as a parent, you have to constantly cater and adjust accordingly to the temperamental style of your child. We know that goodness of fit, and this is backed by research, is linked with less infant negative emotionality. This is by Watts and Bates, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, in 2010. So they found that when parents are more sensitive and responsive to their children, it's involved with less emotional negativity. So that's an important point. It just shows that this stuff works and it helps children transition more effectively. Okay, so what happens when you don't do that? So what happens if you just sort of ignore the temperamental style of your child and you just treat every child exactly the same? Because remember, you may have 3 children, all with different temperamental styles. We call this poorness of fit, meaning the demands and expectations do not fit the child's temperament, abilities, and other characteristics. In other words, the parents are not being sensitive enough, they're not responding in a sensitive way to the temperamental needs and style of their particular child. For example, if we have a child that does not like physical contact, some kids love to be touched, love to be hugged, and that's pretty typical. But sometimes children do not like that. So let's say I have a child who does not like physical contact. I'm not going to try and hug and cuddle them all the time because that would create tension. So if we have a child that's a parent that's forcing him to, be exposed to those certain types of situations, it may create this poorness of fit, and thus the child may become upset by that, and it creates problems. So in other words, it may produce stress in the child. That could be linked to developmental problems if this was a consistent thing. So parents really, so the bottom line is parents really need to understand the temperaments of their child and each one, which could be different, and adjust accordingly. In other words, parents should be demonstrating sensitive responsiveness, which would lead to that goodness of fit stuff that we've talked about. So if I have a difficult child, I'm going to sort of adjust to meet those needs. I'm not going to throw them into situations because that's going to upset them probably. I'm going to have to slowly adjust them and take time to sort of fit that temperamental need. In other words, when parents are doing these types of things, it's going to produce more responsive infants in an appropriate way. What I mean by that is that the infant is going to respond more readily to that type of behavior than if we sort of throw them in a situation that they're very uncomfortable with and produces stress. Okay, so make sure you read the rest of that section in the book there. This will conclude our short lecture on temperamental styles. I hope you guys are enjoying the course, and we'll see you online or in class.